This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. That was a lot.
Yeah, it took some time.
I figure we had maybe 10 hours working together on this. So 20 hours of scraping, but it was worth it because the canvas looks actually really good. I was surprised at how healthy it is and how good it looks. I mean, the million tears and cuts and holes notwithstanding. But sometimes, when you take the glue off of a canvas, you find that the canvas is really deteriorated because of the glue. That's one of the things that water-based glues can do to cotton canvas is they can kind of unravel the strands of cotton, and then when you remove that, the canvas just kind of deteriorates. So that's always a risk, but in this case, it didn't happen, and I wonder if it's because this isn't really canvas. This fabric is something else, and so maybe it sustained exposure to the glue better. Either way, I'll take it. It could have gone a lot worse. But now we have to make some decisions.
Yeah. What's next?
Yeah, what is next? Well, what do you think would be next?
Well, I mean, normally we would go straight to the hot table, but there's so much here that we still have to do. All of these holes, we still have to clean it. All of this leftover patchwork from previous work. I don't really know what we should start with.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the question, right? There is still a ton of work left on this painting, and figuring out which step comes first. Sometimes it's really obvious and it's kind of rote, but it all comes down to the painting and what the painting is going to tell us it can do. So yes, it has to go onto the hot table. We've got a lot of distortions in the canvas, and before we do the lining, we need to get those out. But we still have the facing, and eventually that has to get removed. It still needs to be cleaned, and that's going to be messy. So do we want to clean it before we put it on a new canvas and keep the new canvas clean? That would be great, but there's always a but. We can't quite do that. Ultimately, the next step for this painting is the hot table. But again, the real big issue is the seam.
Yeah.
Because this is not one piece of canvas, it's two, and it was stitched together right along here. And the problem is that this seam, it's not completely flat. It stands up, the two pieces of fabric are together and then the stitching. And so, well, what do you think would happen if we just threw it on the hot table?
I mean, you're going to see a beautiful seam on the face of the painting.
That's right. This texture, which is protruding in the back, is going to be pushed forward. And then we're going to see it on the front of the painting. And there's not really a way to come back from that. That's kind of a fatal mistake that would be made. So we have to deal with this seam. Okay. And the only way to deal with this seam to facilitate the hot table treatment and then ultimately the interleafed lining, because this painting needs a lining and it needs an interleaf. If we didn't have to line the painting, maybe we could do the hot table treatment face down so that the seam stays in the back. And even if we had to line the painting, we could do that face down also. And so the new lining canvas would come here and just kind of conform around the seam. But this painting, because of the massive tears and because of how many that we discovered, there's just every 6 inches there was a little tear. It needs an interleaf, not only to hold everything down, but to give it some more stability and rigidity. And that's where the problem is, because the interleaf means that this seam is going to protrude forward. So we have to get rid of the seam, which is kind of crazy, because right now the two pieces of canvas are well bonded together. They're stitched together, and we're going to have to cut that out and effectively run the risk that this painting comes apart.
Yay.
Yay is right.
But I mean, that feels very aggressive. I mean, we're taking like almost a foot of canvas and we're just hoping that it stays together.
Well, we're not hoping. I mean, remember we faced it, and we faced it with a really heavy washikozo. And so that facing is holding it together. So if we remove the seam, that washikozo becomes the structural element holding these two pieces of canvas together. So that's why we can't remove the washikozo now, because if we do that and then take the seam off, then we have become reckless. We haven't put in some guardrails for us. But as long as it's faced, we'll be fine. The problem then is that once we take the seam off, the facing can't come off until we've done the lining and all the other treatments. So it really is one of those cases where you do this, but then this problem arises. And then you swap this one, but then another one pops up. And that's really so much of what conservation is trying to head off the problems before they become catastrophic, and trying to figure out how to thread this kind of slalom where you can get to the end by changing things around, by improvising here, by inventing here, and doing all that. So it's time to do some surgery.
Thank you.
And careful, these are actual scalpels and appropriately sharp.
Nice.
Ask me how I know. Don't. Now, because this is totally irreversible, we can't put it back. We really just want to be slow and patient and listen to the canvas and take our cues from it. Okay. So, we have this seam and we're trying to get rid of the mass of the excess material. We're not trying to cut the canvas out. We're just trying to get the stitching and kind of the selvage
get
edge
it flush
right off. And I mean, there's no instructions on how to do it except going very slowly and very carefully. And I know this is definitely going to seem crazy to be removing part of the original canvas. But to some degree, this happens all the time. You remember when we were scraping and we were talking about the little slubs in the canvas and how the scraping process was taking them off?
Yeah.
Well, that has to happen when you're doing the lining anyway, even if it doesn't need an interleaf or if the painting isn't catastrophically damaged. Those little bulges and knots in the canvas need to come off. And so, removing parts of the canvas that are going to interfere with treatments that are going to save the painting, it may seem really radical, but it's not. Obviously we'd rather not remove material, but if the choice is to leave the material and kind of seal the painting's fate, a bad fate, or to remove some of the material and save the painting, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? Isn't that kind of like that a doctor will amputate if it's necessary to save the patient's life?
Right.
Right. So that's kind of like what we're doing here. We're kind of amputating this seam so that the painting can survive. And this seam isn't critically important to the content of the work.
And like you said, we're going to do an interleaf, so it'll be stable.
Right, absolutely. In fact, it will be more stable than it's ever been because of the treatments we're going to do to it. I did say I was sick and tired of scraping, and now I'm back scraping.
Right back where we started.
Did you think that I was going to have you, wielding a scalpel on the back of a painting this quickly?
Yes, a very dull one. But yeah, about this time it felt right.
Yeah, I mean, I learned in the crucible of fire, and I kind of feel like the only way that you can actually learn this is to do it. That's the whole point of the apprenticeship, is to get in there and do the hard work, even though it may be scary. Now, obviously, I'm not going to let you do anything that's dangerous to you or the painting, but
stab.
Yeah, well, maybe. But I'm also not going to sugarcoat it. I don't know if you had this impression. I don't think I ever did, by virtue of the way I learned conservation. But I think maybe there's a really romantic idea about what conservators do. And I think conservators perpetuate that myth really well, when in reality, there is a ton of hard, unpleasant, just work that has to go into it. I mean, 20 hours of scraping canvas, glue off of a canvas, that's not fun.
I mean, I am very young. I haven't been doing this very long, but I do kind of get lost in the process. And I think that's one reason I like conservation so much, is that I can kind of just zone in on it. And not zone out, but just kind of...
As she wields the scalpel.
Yeah, just kind of focus on it. And it's something I've always really liked and never really found a career path that kind of highlighted that. And I think that's why I like conservation so much, is the attention to detail, the meticulousness, the hours of doing the same thing. Well, it makes other people, want to leave. I really enjoy it.
Oh, the optimism of youth. Talk to me in a decade when you've scraped for another 1,000 hours.
Sounds good.
Having an assistant, Kit, in the studio is still a really new thing for me. And it takes me back to when I was the assistant in my father's studio, and all the things that he tried to teach me about conservation, working practice, discipline, and of course, business. And all those are the things that I want to teach Kit. But it also brings me back to when I was young and fresh, and I wanted to leave a mark on the studio, and I thought I could teach my father. Hopefully, there will be something of value that Kit can teach me. Jury's still out, but one can hope. I remember when I decided that I wanted to build us a website for the business. That was going to be my big contribution. And my father was a little resistant. He felt that if you had to advertise you weren't doing your job well, people should just know you. But he relented, and I built the website. And it took me way too long. It was way more difficult than it should be, and it was kind of clunky back in the early 2000s. But the strangest thing happened. People started finding us on the internet. Who'd have thunk it? And we started getting clients from all over the country because of this website. Almost overnight, our reach had expanded beyond just the confines of Chicago. And now we were growing. Kind of wild, huh? And eventually, I found out that my father really did love the website. After he died, friends told me that he raved about it. But I wish he would have told me. It would have made a big difference. And I'm keeping that in mind for inevitably when I make Kit design our next website to say thank you, because it will be important. Sorry? Nothing? But luckily for her, there's an easier way. She doesn't have to learn how to code or go through all of the headaches that I did. Luckily, there's Squarespace. How about that for a segue? The truth is, we use the internet for, well, everything, and if you don't have a little piece of it staked as your own, well, you're losing out. And even if you're not running a business and you just want to showcase yourself or your passion, you never know. That may turn into a business. Let's say you're real into photography and you want to showcase your work. So you build a website with a gallery and people start taking notice. And next thing you know, you add in an e-commerce solution and you can sell some of those photos. And then after that, people start wanting to book you for speaking engagements. So you add a scheduling feature. And hey, a little attention feels good. So you enable a marketing campaign and wow, it takes off from there. And this may all seem like a pie in the sky, but you know what? If you don't build it, they will not come. And unlike me, you don't have to toil over HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all sorts of weird programming languages. Squarespace has done all that hard work for you, so all you have to focus on is making sure that your website looks good and reflects you. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. With that pesky seam removed, Kit and I can make a final pass over the painting to make sure we didn't miss any areas, looking for glue spots or little slubs in the canvas, even as something as tiny as that little piece of glue. In the next step, we'll create a deformation on the front of the painting. Once I've gotten all of that stuff off, and you can see there was a lot, I'll clean it up with my dustpan. I will go over this a couple of times, and then ultimately with my hand just to make sure I haven't missed anything. The next treatment takes place on the big hot table, because the painting is, well, big, you guessed it. By using moisture, heat, and pressure, we can eliminate all of those planar distortions. Those are the bumps, ripples, waves, and dents that are so problematic when the light is caught. Because my blotter paper isn't big enough to cover the entire painting, I have to stitch it together using some tape. This isn't a problem. I've done it many times before. The tape doesn't leave an impression. But if it did, I would have to come up with another solution. Big paintings like this require all sorts of creative approaches. Because the painting was covered in rabbit skin glue, and though we tried to remove almost all of it, there is still a thin residual layer left, including the sizing that's in the canvas. If we do this treatment directly on the blotter paper, we are going to glue the blotter paper to the canvas, and that's going to be a mess. So we use that green film to create a release. It allows air and moisture to pass through while not sticking to the rabbit skin glue, keeping the blotter clean and the back of the painting free of paper. Transferring this painting is really hard. There's a seam that's no longer attached in the canvas. In fact, the only thing that's holding it now is the paint and the washi kozo. So having Kit's assistance here is really critical. I've transferred big paintings before, and let me tell you, it is nerve-wracking and sweat-inducing, and certainly not as easy as this. So the painting goes down on the green film, and we haven't added any moisture to this canvas, because even though the blotter paper will absorb moisture, it can't get all of it out. What we're relying on is the ambient moisture in the studio that the canvas has absorbed to act as a softening agent when this painting is exposed to heat. You'd think that 40% humidity in your studio wouldn't result in a lot of moisture in the canvas, but one would be surprised. So once everything's in place, we turn on the vacuum pump and the heat, extract all the air, creating a nice downward pressure on the painting, bring it up to temperature, and soften that canvas. Over the seam, I'm using a bone folder just to make sure that it gets nice and flat. Because we removed the excess canvas, we can do that. We couldn't do this before. After a few days under weights, the painting has now acclimatized to the studio, and it is now flat. But of course we have to drag all of these weights and sheets of drywall back to where we took them from to get access to the painting. Again, having an assistant is really, really nice. The sheet of felt can get rolled up. It did its job protecting the face of the painting, and, well, everything seems really smooth, which is precisely what we're going for. And yeah, it seems like a foregone conclusion, but when dealing with a really big painting like this, nothing is ever sure. A slight leak can create bubbles, or inaccurate temperature can be devastating. So now we'll flip the painting over and keep it on the hot table here, because this table is large enough to support the entire painting, whereas the tables in the front were just a few inches too short. And we'll turn to washi kozo, our old friend, and tear a whole bunch of little strips. I don't know if you can tell, but me and Kit are vigorously racing here. I think she won. These little strips are going to be used to stabilize where the seam is. Remember, we cut off all of the stitching, and so if we remove the facing, well, the painting will just come apart in two. Using a little bit of adhesive, I'm going to lay down the washi kozo and just press it with my finger to make sure it's smooth. Then I'll press it with a weight so that while it dries, it doesn't distort. We'll go across the entire seam, making sure that it is well secured. And even though this washi kozo is of the thinner variety, we don't want to make a bump on the face of the painting. It will support it. After a few days of resting under weights and then felt, we can come back and see that it's nice and smooth, and this seam has now been stabilized. The painting, in fact, is strong enough now that we can just flip it over without having to be nervous about it coming apart. And it has to be flipped over because now we remove the facing. Because this fish gelatin is hygroscopic, warm water will soften it up, and then we can peel it back. It does take a few minutes for the adhesive to activate and become soft enough that we can remove the kozo. So we'll work ahead of ourselves so that as we pull off some of the kozo, the next area is ready to pull off. We don't want to have to stop and wait at any point. We want to work fluidly through the process. One of the benefits of using the heavier weight washi kozo is that it doesn't disintegrate as we remove it, like the lighter stuff. Where it's still stuck, a little bit of water in place and a palette knife can remove it. Ultimately, there will be lots of little fuzzies left over, but we'll get rid of all of those. This kozo is so strong, in fact, that we can just pull it back, much like we did the canvas. It is a testament to what mulberry paper can do. Every now and again, the use of a palette knife is really helpful. But you can see it comes off in pretty big sheets. Now, one of the benefits of using this approach is that the washi kozo and the fish gelatin adhere to some of that surface grime, and so when we remove it, it takes off a lot of that grime. Removing the excess fish gelatin with a little bit of enzyme cleaner also reveals just how much gunk was sitting on the surface that is now no longer an issue. We do have to flip the painting back over again, and this time we're going to employ some cardboard sheets, because even though the painting has been stabilized at the tear, we don't want to take any chances. And the reason we had to flip it over is to do some inlays. When this painting was previously conserved, they didn't inlay these holes with canvas, they just filled them in with paint, and all of that paint has to go. Using some dental tools and scalpels, fingers, whatever works, we will dig out all of that old paint and reveal the edges of the canvas. I'll turn to my stock of old canvas and pull a couple of different pieces that I think will fit. We're looking for something that has a similar weight and texture. So we'll compare a bunch, and ultimately we'll find something that works. And when we do, we can start preparing the inlays. Luckily, the second choice is the winner. Once trimmed to small sections, we can feed it underneath the canvas to where the holes are, and then align that canvas according to the grain with the existing. Once it's in position and lined, we can use a pencil and trace the area that we need to cut out. I'm going to try to be really precise here because we want to make sure that there is canvas touching canvas and not a whole bunch of gaps, because that would result in an inlay that wasn't as secure. Dueling scissors here, and I won this time. And just like that, my inlay goes in and does Kit's. But of course, the inlay won't be held in place if we just leave it like that. So we're turning to washi kozo again. Just like we did stabilizing the seam, we're going to hold these little inlays in place. A little bit of adhesive painted on the canvas, over the edges, and then once it's spread out evenly, we'll lay this washi kozo down, go over it with the brush, making sure that we've got good penetration of the adhesive, and then of course we will press it using some release film, a piece of felt, and a weight. Now, despite stabilizing the seam and those inlays with the washi kozo, there are significant tears throughout this painting that just can't be addressed with the washi. They also can't be addressed with bridging or localized repairs. On top of that, the canvas is really, really brittle. And so in this case, the painting needs a lining. And I'm preparing my Belgian linen for that process. But this painting is also going to be receiving an interleaf between the new lining here and the original canvas. And what the interleaf is going to do is add some rigid support to this otherwise floppy canvas. It's also going to immobilize it and make it less prone to expansion with humidity changes, which will go a long way in making sure that those cracks and those tears don't open up. I'm adding a flat spun nylon gossamer on top of the piece, just for a little bit more fidelity with the adhesive. I have found that adding this allows me to have a thicker adhesive without it becoming too gummy or gooey or messy. And this matters because it helps make sure that all of the canvas makes contact with adhesive that then makes contact with the PET film, which is the interleaf. I heat up the adhesive, get it to a liquid state, adjust how thin or thick I want it, and then use a roller to evenly apply it across the entire painting. And what I'm trying to do here is make sure that there is an even distribution of adhesive throughout every spot of the canvas. I don't want areas to be starved, and I don't want areas to be overly fed. That would result in an inconsistent bond, just like the previous lining. While that adhesive is drying, I can cut and prepare the PET film. This is the same PET film that's used in recyclable water bottles, and it is rigid but thin. I'm using a similar adhesive film, and it looks like I have just enough. Whew. And I'll peel back the film from the release layer. I'll save all of these release layers because I can use them in other projects. And then I'll lay down this film onto the canvas. And then I will start to adhere it. Using a hot iron and a cold weight, I can make sure that it is well bonded without creating any ripples. If I don't use this weight, ripples occur, and that is a problem. So after doing the initial pass, I will turn it over to Kit and let her toil away at this process. Sometimes it's nice having an assistant to do things that you don't want to, have done for years and are ready to teach someone else how to do. Yeah, that's it. But we still have to prepare the PET film. It needs adhesive on both sides, otherwise it just won't stick to the adhesive film and to the canvas. So I can roll it out, and just like applying the adhesive to the canvas, I'll heat up some more, I'll thin it out, this time a little bit thinner because it just needs to be a thin coating on this film. And I will go over it, making sure that I have a nice even layer. When the first application is dry, I can flip it over and do a second. And while that's drying, we can begin trimming off the excess flat spun nylon gossamer. We don't need any of this excess material, and it's just not necessary to be seen. All of the work is done behind the canvas, and so all of this excess can just be trimmed off. Using a sharp scalpel, we can just glide across and follow the contours of the canvas and remove all of this excess. This is a waste product. Unfortunately, it's too small to salvage. With the PET film dry and trimmed to fit the painting, we can then tack it into place in the corners using the iron and a little bit of release film. This is just temporary so that while we are handling the canvas, it doesn't move. This is a big canvas and a big piece of PET film, and if it moves or misregisters, it could be a problem. If that happens and we don't catch it, well, that's a big problem, and we will have to undo the lining and start all over again, something I and Kit are keen to avoid. Once we've flipped over this canvas, we can begin unrolling the lining canvas and laying out the painting on it. Now, it's certainly possible to move the painting, unroll the canvas, move the painting back, but we can do it this way, and it's just faster and easier, particularly with 4 hands. But before we can actually do the lining, we have to take off the release film that was on top of the film adhered to the canvas. And so we're going to pull it off, try to be slick about it, and then slide it back underneath. This way, the painting stays put, and we can remove that release film without messing up the registration, without tearing the film, and without having to do excess amount of work. These little tips save a ton of headaches and time. We're also going to save this release film and use it on the front of the painting. Some of that adhesive may have oozed through some of the holes or cracks, and I want to make sure that nothing gets stuck to this painting, that the top coating of PET film doesn't get adhered. The release will make that possible. And of course, we have to create an evacuation channel for the air that's going to be trapped in the envelope we will create to do the lining. And using cotton webbing, 2 or 3 layers around the painting is all that's needed. I'm not going to go across the face of the painting because we're going to be using heat and higher pressure, and I don't want to run the risk that I create any indentations in the painting. Now finally, atop this is a layer of regular PET, or Mylar, and we've taped 2 pieces together because the painting is a little bit too big for one sheet, and we're just making sure that it covers the entire area. And then we'll go ahead and tape it all down and make sure that we have a nice seam that is airtight. Finally, we will add our through bag connectors, which are how we can evacuate the air, put on the vacuum attachments, turn on the heat, let it get warmed up. We don't need to turn the vacuum on until the adhesive is active. But when it's active, we can turn the vacuum pump on, draw out all of that air, create an even pressure downwards on the entire painting, and let the hot table do its thing. And when we're done, after this structural work is complete, well, we can start actually cleaning the painting and seeing what kind of problems we have ahead of us on the next episode.